We're very pleased to welcome you here to the Wheeler Centre tonight for this question time on Indigenous recognition in the Constitution, which is of course one of the most important issues that we as a country are going to be facing in the next couple of years. As George noted in his book, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, on the Constitution can seem very distant in people's lives, but actually really it has a profound effect on our courts, on our government, on our way of life. So it does have a very practical impact. So this question of Indigenous recognition is really key to how we move forward as Australians. And of course the original Constitution didn't allow for Indigenous people to be counted as part of the population. The 67 referendum left unfinished business because it deleted discrimination against Aboriginal people but left nothing in its place. And Australia is now the only democracy in the world that has clauses in the Constitution which permit discrimination on the basis of race, which is quite incredible really when you think about our country. So what we want to talk about tonight is all of the symbolic, the practical implications of this change, the idea of what the words should be in any referendum and any other questions that you have, because really this is your evening. We have an incredible panel here this evening. I was saying earlier in the green room, I don't think we've ever had so many gongs on one stage all together, which is, these really are the experts in the field. So this evening, please don't be shy to put up your hand and ask a question. We've got two ushers here with microphones who are ready to take questions. And my warning is that typically what happens is everyone's a little bit shy at the beginning, and then at the end, no one gets to have their question answered because there are too many hands up. So if you've got a question, get in early, is my advice. So let me begin with the introduction of our panel this evening. We've got Jill Gallagher, who's a Gunditj Mara woman from Western Victoria, who's been a leader of the Victorian Aboriginal community all of her life, and for the last 14 years has been working as CEO of the Victorian Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisation. George Williams is one of Australia's leading constitutional lawyers and public commentators. He's a professor of law at the University of New South Wales, and he has written and edited 34 books on the Australian government and the Constitution, including Everything You Need to Know About the Referendum to Recognise Indigenous Australians, which I can highly recommend, having devoured it in the last month or so. Patricia Turner is an Arandara woman. She has had a renowned public service career, including as CEO of ATSIC, Deputy Secretary of the Commonwealth Departments of Aboriginal Affairs and Prime Minister and Cabinet. She flew in yesterday from Alice to be with us today. And Frank Brennan also wears many hats. He is, of course, a Jesuit priest, Professor of Law at the Australian Catholic University, Adjunct Professor of Law at the College of Law and the National Centre for Indigenous Studies at the ANU, and he has a very long history working in Indigenous recognition and justice. He's also the author of No Small Change, The Road to Recognition for Indigenous Australia, which is also on sale and also I can very much highly recommend. So before we get going, Jill, I would just like to ask you to acknowledge where we are tonight.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, acknowledge the elders of the Kulin Nation in which we meet here today, and all the people who have an interest who came here today, so thank you very much.
And Jill, I just want to start with you. Working as you do in a professional level in Aboriginal health, what does the Constitution mean for professionally in your sphere? What impact does it have?
Okay, I work in Aboriginal health and have done for the past 20 years. Constitutional reform or recognition has really never been on our agenda. But in recent times it has been, when you look at the impact that Aboriginal people suffer today from colonisation, what the past things that happen to our mob in our communities and the impact that it has on Aboriginal people today, how it has manifested. The fact that we're not recognised in a document such as Australia's Constitution also impacts, I believe, on our emotional and spiritual well-being. So I think it has enormous impact on Aboriginal communities across the country in relation to knowing that this country acknowledges and appreciates and values Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this country has an enormous impact on our well-being.
George, I just want to ask you the nuts and bolts question, as you are the constitutional expert. I mean, I don't want to assume too much knowledge on the part of everyone here, because certainly I don't know a hell of a lot about the Australian Constitution. What is it for? What does it actually do, and how does it impact on our lives?
Well, and you have to say you're in good company. And one poll asked Australians, do we have a written constitution? And 1 in 2 said no. So we're dealing here with a debate where around half of the community doesn't actually know we have a document that we need to change to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the reason people need to know is because the Constitution is the rule book of the nation. It's the one that says at the most basic level who can exercise power over whom. And if you're an Indigenous person, that question of power is fundamentally important. It's the Constitution that licensed the laws that restricted the marriage rights of Aboriginal people, that took away land, permitted the removal of children, permitted the intervention in the Northern Territory, permitted a longer list of laws that denied a fair wage. And if you want to ask, well, how could those things happen in our community? How could we actually create a group in our community and subject them to discriminatory laws that treated them not actually as second-class citizens, but as just not as part of our community at all? Well, the answer is because the Australian Constitution was drafted to permit exactly that. And it was drafted at a time when Aboriginal people were counted as being a dying race. They were the words used in the 1890s, and to this very day we have a constitution that still counts people in that way as not a group that really should be counted or included in the community like the rest of us.
Patricia, I did want to ask you a similar question to the one that I asked Jill. I mean, working as you do and have done for such a long time, what connection do you see between the Constitution and disadvantage, Aboriginal disadvantage?
Well, I think the question of disadvantage has to be, or can be addressed, not only through constitutional change, but through other measures, which can be done more immediately and should be done more immediately. For me, constitutional recognition of our peoples means a maturing of a nation that's prepared to face up to its history, its true history. Since colonisation, only a couple of 100 years old, our people were here for 40,000 years, at least. So, it's time we grew up. And we, as a peoples, showed the world that we acknowledge the true history of Australia, that we were there long before the British colonised us, and that our culture is rich, our languages are rich, our way of life is rich, and that we have made a very significant contribution to this nation. So we want to be part of the Constitution. We want Australia to acknowledge our shared history, and we believe that it's not just, I believe it's good for the psyche of the whole nation not to live a lie anymore.
I mean, I think that the polls bear you out, don't they?
They do.
The latest poll that I was reading today suggested that 85, or actually probably
Yes.
a bit less, of an
No,
Australian.
that's right.
One poll that I was reading was that the no had actually firmed up a little and is now closer to the 16%. So the don't knows, and obviously there's polls and there's polls, but certainly the overwhelming percentage of the population is ready for this. But Frank Brennan, I mean, are we, in terms of the politicians, how close are we at this stage to actually having something ready to present to the Australian people at a referendum?
I don't think we're as close as we should be, and in part I think that's because of the lack of bipartisanship in our parliament. And if I might say respectfully, I think the lack of real leadership of our major political parties, if you look at things historically. And the other thing I would say is that in terms of Indigenous Australia coming to the table, I think these have been very difficult times. They've had to suffer enormous budgetary cutbacks and things like that. They've also, if I may say respectfully as a non-Indigenous person, I think since the demise of ATSIC, whatever its pros and cons, I think there's been a sense of trying to find where is the Aboriginal voice at the national table. So putting all of those things together, I think means that politically it's a very difficult mix at the moment. Even though there's public sympathy out there, getting the ducks in a row, I think we're not as close to it as we should be.
No, I mean, Noel Pearson last week was quite scathing, actually, of the bipartisan meeting at Kirribilli. He said he would have preferred to have sent a cardboard cutout. I just wonder what particularly Patricia and Jill thought of that meeting, because you were there, Patricia, weren't you? Yeah.
We were, yes.
You were there as well,
first,
Jill?
yes.
Yeah.
Well, my feel at that meeting at Kirribilli House was that both the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten reinforced again to the people that were around that table that there is bipartisan support to go forward with a referendum. And he's still very keen on 2017. So, and the Aboriginal delegates, well, most of us anyways, who are around that table, we met the day before Kirribilli House. And Congress, who is our only elected national voice, Aboriginal voice, were the spokespeople for what we decided on the Sunday. And that was that we asked that we wanted... out of that came, we were seeking recommitment, whether there was still bipartisan support, and they both said yes. Whether there's going to be more conversations, focused conversations within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and I think that's been agreed to. They've agreed to establish some sort of constitutional council to assist in developing the questions, I suppose, if that's what... Am I right there, Pat?
Yes.
So I was confident. I was very confident coming out of that meeting that 2017 will happen, a referendum in 2017. But I think the challenge for us as all Australians is basically what is that question going to be? The Aboriginal delegates that did turn up on the Sunday, we basically said on the Monday, we basically said to the Prime Minister and to the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, that we would not accept symbolism. We just don't want a referendum that's just going to have symbols, symbolic gestures in it.
And what would symbolism be to you?
Well,
maybe mention that there were Aboriginal people here well before settlements in a preamble, some sort of preamble. We would not accept that. That's the feel that we would not accept a symbolic approach to constitutional reform. We wanted some, and I'll let Pat speak in more detail about this, we wanted more meaningful change that all of us, not only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians, but also all Australians would benefit from. Pat.
There's a gentleman down there who wants to ask a question.
Well, I will definitely get to that gentleman there. I've seen him with his waving hand.
All right.
Waving, not drowning. So we'll get to him in just 1 second. But
all right, thank you. Look, I've been to meetings with Prime Ministers and opposition leaders, but never both of them in the same room. So it was a really rare opportunity. And I must say that our delegation was masterful, in my view. We did not discuss the proposals that have been put put forward to date, because we were more interested in getting agreement on a process from now to when we have the referendum. It was important that we nailed them down to agree what that process would be. I think that despite Noel's criticism, it was not my observation.
Yeah.
I totally disagree with his assessment of it. And I think that probably since the meeting, there have been conversations among our peoples, and Noel has agreed to work more cooperatively with us, which is a good thing.
Very good.
Now, the process in going forward will not only mean further consultations with our people, and we need to do that because on the Sunday, when we went into our own caucus, most of us, what we said was, you know, forget about all the work that's been done. Let's just focus on what constitutional recognition should look like for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What should it look like for us? And then let's take account of, you know, the various proposals. But most importantly, let's look at how we're going to get all of the vast majority of our people on board and supporting us. Because if we have a united front, other Australians are more likely to come and say, well, if that's what the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people want, we agree.
We might come back to that issue of unanimity further, but let me go first to this this questioner. Just that gentleman there in the blue tie, yes. And everyone else, please get ready with your hands up.
My question is really on the constitutional side. Do we need two referendums? One to introduce a preamble that recognises the original ownership of the land by Aborigines, and then second, a referendum to get rid of all of the discriminatory elements of the current constitution, and it seems to me it's very complicated and very difficult.
George, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, sure. And there's probably three things that will be done. One is to introduce the symbolism, some words of acknowledgement. The second thing is to take out those clauses you mentioned that actually permit discrimination on the basis of race, such as Section 25, which is headed races disqualified from voting, and still to this day permits any state to stop people voting in state elections because of their race. And then the third thing it might do is actually put in a new power so that laws can be made for Indigenous peoples, but hopefully limited in some way so it can't be used to discriminate into the future. Now, the short answer is all three can be done in the one question. And in fact, that's the way the process works. Typically, one thing deals with a package, and Australians will probably have on their ballot paper something like, do you agree with a bill for amending the Constitution to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, yes or no? And that bill will encapsulate the full range of changes in one question.
But theoretically, you could have three separate questions, provided you ensured that one or more questions getting up, there were no internal contradictions. And that may well be something to look at.
Does that answer your question? Yes, sir. Thanks.
I would like to make a point on a lesser issue briefly and then ask a question on a major issue. The lesser issue is this. I am worried about more semantic double dealing by which the term Indigenous is now being used by people publicly and even by authorities who are too scared to use the term Aboriginal. I was born in this country, though I'm primarily of Irish stock, but I'm Indigenous, whereas the Prime Minister of this country is not. So I merely want to say that in passing, but here's the major issue. I would like to know what are the definable grounds upon which a constitution can be validated. That is, what is the source of a constitution's authority? And the second adjunct to that is, what are its agents?
Okay, I think we might deal with your first point first of all and just see what the panel members make about that. I mean, do you...
Well, I personally don't like using the word Indigenous to describe our people. If I'm talking about my own group, Aranda people, we talk about the Aranda Nation. And many of our peoples throughout Australia refer to themselves as a part of a particular nation. So I prefer the terms, if I'm using a generic term, Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, because we are the two groups that were here before the British colonised us, and in generic terms. But we all have our own language groups that we refer to.
I mean, I think that your point is very well made, actually, and I also have noticed the term Indigenous becoming much more widely used.
I think it's bureaucratic convenience.
I was wondering about it.
It is bureaucratic convenience. They just got too lazy to write Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which is what I always insisted on in the public sector when I was the head of the commission. I would not allow my staff to use the term Indigenous. We always wrote it out in full. But a lot of people in the bureaucracy are too lazy and they just prefer to write Indigenous Australians.
Well, even internationally now, with the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I mean, it's taken off through the UN.
Yes, regrettably.
What were you going to say, John?
At an international platform, Indigenous talks about all Indigenous peoples in the world, so you can understand that. But for Australia, I agree with the gentleman. When I was growing up, it was Aboriginal, well, it was a lot cruder than that, by the way, but Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. About 3 years ago, we wrote on behalf of Aboriginal health sector, through our national body, we wrote to the government and said, we take offence to the term Indigenous. We would prefer to be referred to as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, please. But they, as Pat said, they're just lazy.
So we'll address your second question, and I tried to write it down. What are the definable grounds upon which a constitutional change can be made? Was that
no?
By which a constitution exists. Okay.
Yeah,
that's a big question. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, look, I can tackle it if you want. It's certainly something people write a bit about. And I mean, if you turn to America, their answer is "we the people," and their constitution begins with those immortal words, and it's "we the people" that provide the source of validation, the sovereignty, the authority.
And yet that didn't include the Aboriginal Americans.
No.
Well, not that's right. I mean, of course, they come from a past that certainly wasn't inclusive at that point. If you turn to the opening words of our Constitution, which is a British Act, it begins with that immortal word "whereas," and it says, "Whereas the people of the colonies," but it actually doesn't even mention Western Australia. It only mentions 5 of them. So we've got this odd beginning which doesn't give you a good hint. It misses out the West. And of course, it was a constitution where, when they were talking about the people of the colonies, they were not talking about the First Nations.
No.
They were not included. So we've got this real problem in this country. When we ask, well, why does our constitution have a source of authority? It was an act of the British Parliament that constituted as a nation, but in doing so left out those First Peoples. And we've never had that moment of nation building that has properly constituted us, as a complete unified nation.
Was that the answer to your question?
That's
Yeah.
much of it.
All right, fantastic. Can we get a microphone up to this gentleman here in the front with the red scarf, please?
Thank you. Jill, you particularly stressed the importance of going beyond symbolism, and I would totally support that. But I wonder if both you and Patricia could talk a little bit about what that means in practice. What are the issues? What are the possibilities?
Pat, you want to have a go?
Yes. Well, look, I think that in my experience, when we dealt with the native title decision of the High Court, the then Prime Minister Keating said, "I'll give you a 3-part package. I'll give you native title legislation because I need that to give certainty to the farmers and the pastoralists for the leases, and I also need to have a way to handle native title claims and processes." So We need legislation. Second, I will give you a land fund to buy back land that will never be able to be claimed. And third, I will give you a social justice package. So that's it. Social Justice Commissioner and the Reconciliation Council, we all produced social justice reports. ATSICS was called Recognition, Rights and Reform, and had a whole series of Indigenous specific rights outlined, as well as, you know, more general matters, including constitutional recognition. I believe that, you know, just going solely for constitutional recognition would not be doing justice to meet the practical needs of our people. So I believe we need a major fund towards self-sufficiency, I would call it.
In addition to what already exists within the current
Well,
structures?
you know, what already exists is a bit of a myth in terms of the way that it's portrayed by the government, and, you know, it's a bit of a smokes and mirrors job in terms of what we used to have. And, you know, in their first budget, they cut $500 million out of Indigenous affairs, you know. The poorest people with the worst health and education and all the rest of it. I mean, how could you possibly justify taking $500 million in one budget?
I mean, sorry, go on.
Sorry. So I think that there is a package of measures. I would have a towards self-sufficiency fund committed very soon, in the next budget, in fact, or the next election, promise. Both parties. I would also have a much more representative engagement, a body that engaged with the Commonwealth Government on an ongoing basis. I'm not confident in the Congress model, the National Congress model. I want a more substantive body. I don't agree that the mundane advisory committee is sufficient, and I don't agree that there should be white people on it. I think we've got enough brains and experience and knowledge and expertise within our own community to advise the government of the day on matters that affect our people most directly. I believe, as Frank and I have discussed many times, and we would agree on this, that we need to have regional bodies that feed the knowledge to that national body, and I also believe that we should have substantive change in the Constitution. So my preference is to have a non-discrimination clause, as well as a acknowledgement, respect and protection of our cultural heritage, languages, lands, waters, and have a capacity for our unique, longest living culture in the world to survive, to be cherished, and to be enjoyed by all Australians.
And practically, I suppose protection essentially means some of the things that you've been talking about in terms of the fund and more substantive actually work.
I'm not talking about the fund being in the Constitution. I'm saying these are legislative or administrative matters that a government could do straight away and should do straight away. You know, you can't rely on a small body like Warren's body. Nothing, you know, this is not about personalities. This is about the arrangement is wrong. I think the machinery of government arrangements are very wrong. I think the Prime Minister has made a disastrous mistake in declaring himself the Minister for Indigenous Affairs. He simply doesn't have the time.
He's also the Minister for Women as well.
Yes.
It's very busy.
And so I feel it twice.
So can I just add to that?
Of course,
so
yeah, go for
what
it,
I
Jill.
wanted to add was I agree with everything that Pat said. And the things that you talked about is a future fund or whatever it may be. Yeah, we're not advocating that should be in the Constitution. And what I mean by substantive change, as opposed to symbolism, there will be symbolism, a symbolic, whether it's in the preamble or whether whatever, I don't know, the legal wiggles will have to work that out. But fixing up the discrimination laws that affects us all, not just us as Aboriginal Australians. That affects us all as all Australians. One of the and the other thing that Pat spoke about was a body, some body that I believe it should be in the Constitution, because ATSIC was set up by government and it was taken away by government. Prime Minister's advisory committees are set up at the whim of a government and can be taken away at the whim of a government. And Congress does its best, and that's the closest thing we've got to a national voice. But it has been, I believe, gutted. Their funding has been pulled, and so the Prime Minister goes and sets up another voice that he listens to. To me, that's not a voice that we would like to... if it's set up in a constitution, then it'd be very hard for anyone to get rid of. And it's not a voice that makes all these decisions. It's what's been put on the table is about a body that's set up in the Constitution that will advise Parliament.
So you're not talking about an Aboriginal Parliament?
No,
se,
definitely not. Definitely
body.
not. Definitely not. Mm-hmm. We know that probably won't get anywhere. So we do have to be realistic. But at the end of the day, we do need a voice at a very strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice at the national level. And we don't have that at the moment.
Yes, sir, just down in the front here.
I just wanted to go back to something that George said earlier. This is a point of clarification in case I misunderstood it. The question that you were responding to concerned the sort of separation or separate identification of different elements of the suggestion, symbolic, removal of discriminatory clauses, and the installation of some sort of machinery or provision or something that deals specifically with, or could be used to deal specifically with, Indigenous issues. And if I understood you correctly, you suggested that the question that would be put to the Australian people in a referendum would, in a sense, bundle all of those into a sort of a fairly generic language. I think that is a major problem, because, I mean, I have to say I completely support the recognition of Aboriginal people in the Constitution. My fear is that this whole debate, which almost inevitably is going to be seen by the wider mainstream as a debate occurring within this sort of enlightened niche. If we use a generic question in which these things are bundled and undifferentiated, we are going to scare people away from this. And we are actually going to kill the very thing that we're trying to get done here. I don't think it's a good idea, and I guess my invitation is for further comment on this. I don't think it's a good idea to be saying, well, you know, ask a general question and then leave it up to politicians as informed by some group out there, even if it includes us, to then work out the detail. People are just going to go, who are these people who are advising the government? We don't know, you know, where this is going to go.
Is that what you were suggesting? And then I'll come to you, Frank, as well, because you write about this in your book. So.
Yeah, look, you're right in identifying a problem, but it's not easy to fix, and that's because the way the system works is when people get that ballot paper, all they're voting yes or no to is actually the name of the bill. That's all. Well, you can separate the questions, but then you have 3 separate questions, and you may get yes, no, yes, and the experience also is the more questions you ask, the more no votes you get. And people tend to start voting no as they go down the ballot paper, or simply they start to get worried because they don't know a lot about what's being asked. So if you ask multiple questions, you're raising a different set of issues that may make it harder to get up. But that said, I recognise the strength of what you say. When you've got a generic question on the ballot paper, it can throw up a lot of misconceptions and problems. And the 1967 referendum is a very good example of this. I mean, after all, that was the referendum that gave Aboriginal people a vote. It was the referendum that turned Aboriginal people into citizens, and neither of those things is true. Yet people think that is true, in part because they voted on a ballot paper that didn't set out much detail. I mean, you can get the information, but you know, it's a difficulty with our process that it lends itself to misinformation and misunderstanding, including about this really important referendum that few Australians understand.
And Frank, you talk about the idea of the sorts of questions that should actually be put and how far we should go in what are your views on that?
Well, I acknowledged to the gentleman earlier that you could have separate questions, and I think that's something you'd look at down the track. Part of the issue is that I think, like tonight, we're hearing from Jill and Pat, a very fine, eloquent list of issues that Aboriginal Australia is wanting to put to us. Now, it seems to me that the problem we have politically, and that's why I was going back to leadership before, is I think it's very important for those of us who are not Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander to be attentive to those aspirations. But I then think there is a major obligation on the leaders of our major political parties, having heard those aspirations, to tell us what of those aspirations they are prepared to sponsor and to take to the people and sell to the people in terms of a referendum. But then, because I think we have matured more as a polity than we had in 1967, I think a critical next step is then for the leaders of Indigenous Australia to tell us, all right, that's what our political leaders are prepared to propose. Are we, as Indigenous Australians, Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, are we prepared to say, yes, for the moment, that is a package which we think is appropriate? Or do we want to say, look, thank you very much, but we think that is so modest, to maintain our own dignity, we'd like to walk away. Now, I think it's only once we've been through that sort of process, we can then come to the difficult mechanical questions as to, all right, what should be the question or questions in this referendum? And for example, in contradistinction to George, I would have some sympathy to the idea of looking that ultimately you might want to structure a question about recognition which would be different from a question about non-discrimination, so that all being well, both questions would get up, but that you wouldn't want to lose everything. But I think they're the sorts of questions which we'd have to be attentive to the Aboriginal leaders as we walk through those difficult processes, including a constitutional convention.
I'll just pick you up there on your point about the discrimination, clause or whatever you want to call it, because you actually don't support, do you, the idea of putting a clause in the Constitution that preventing the Commonwealth from discriminating specifically against Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people?
Well, ideally I do. In fact, I claim the credit in 1994 of having first floated it and then proposing it very strongly in 1996. But given what we all went through with what Pat was talking about with the native title exercise, particularly in 1998, then there were enormous legal difficulties, which I don't want to go into tonight, but I can talk to you later about them if you like. But in terms of getting the balance right between the Native Title Act and the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, those issues would all have to be clarified before you put a question to the Australian people. To put it very bluntly, in 1998, Bob Brown, on behalf of the Greens, said that the Parliament should legislate to say the Native Title Act should be strictly subject to the Racial Discrimination Act. Now, not only John Howard said no to that, the Labor Party said no to that. They said it wouldn't give us certainty for the future, for miners, for pastoralists, etc. So those issues have to be dealt with so that the Australian public can accept in good faith that, yes, this is a safe way forward. Because let's make no mistake, I don't want to rabbit on, so close me down if you want to.
Please do. That's what you're here for.
If you look at our records since the Second World War, we've had 8 successful referenda. Since the Second World War, we've had 5. This is a country which has, as I say, constitutional sclerosis. If you look at the 5 successful referenda, 2 of them dealt with Commonwealth power. One was to give the power to pay social security payments. Well, of course we all voted for that. The second was to take out the adverse references to Aborigines so that the Commonwealth could make laws with respect to Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders. The other 3 successful referenda have just been issues of housekeeping. Retirement age of judges, replacing senators with people of the same party, allowing people from the territories to vote in referenda. So you can appreciate the Australian sense on constitutional change is very cautious and very conservative. And everyone, including the Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, know that, and that's what we've got to come to terms with as we move forward in this practically.
And can I get a sense? Okay, sure, Pat, go ahead.
Look, because we've had 44 referendum and only 8 have been successful, when we do take the question of our recognition to referendum, we want it to succeed, you know, and we're not going to do it if we're not going to get the level of support. Because not our people that will have got the numbers, it's you mob, you know. You got the numbers to vote yes. So we need people on board. But one of the things I want to caution people about is the unintended consequences of changes to the Constitution. And that's the issue that we're examining very, very carefully now since our meeting with the 2 leaders in Sydney. And this question of non-discrimination is one that we would dearly love, you know, but we don't want to be undoing the certainty of native title or the leases that were ratified with the native title legislation. That's not what we're about. You know, we want the pastoralists and the farmers and the miners and whatever who've got legitimate leases to maintain their rights. We're not about taking it off them. You know, after all, we were so generous when they stole it off us in the first place. But, not to trivialise it, sorry. I couldn't help that.
I don't think you need to apologise.
However, we're not about undoing native title, okay? But we are about getting things right. Now, I'm an incrementalist. I'll go for the best change I can get at any given time. One day we will become a republic. And when we do, we have a fantastic opportunity to really show our maturity as a nation. And there'll be a whole lot of things that we could deal with in that context. Nevertheless, when we do go for referendum change on recognition of our peoples, let's make sure we've covered off all the unintended consequences. We've looked at every conceivable way of achieving the best possible package, and there will be a very large public awareness campaign that will be continued. We've impressed upon that upon the leaders, that recognise his role needs to continue to raise the public awareness across the whole of the Australian community, not just among our own peoples. They've done a fantastic job so far, but once the models start to firm up, they'll have a more important role. When we have the regional conventions, which the Prime Minister and Shorten have agreed to, or, pardon me, consultations, whatever they choose to call them, we want to have the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander meetings first, so we get our people across the line on the complexities of the issues, and then open it up to a general public meeting so that everyone can come in and we can educate everybody and we can answer all the questions and do all of the, you know, really solid consultations so that when people do go to vote, they have the best possible understanding of the issues. But the detail of the referendum matter is in the legislation, not in the ballot paper, which is something that you also have to keep an eye to.
Okay, who else have we got? Yes, please.
I was interested in Pat and Jill's comment about the meeting with the Prime Minister and Bill Shorten, and yet to the average Australian, all we got out of that was a few bites about the fact that Noel Pearson wanted to send a cardboard cutout. You speak about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders being able to explain what you're on about, so that, as you say, the rest of the mob will know what they're voting for. Now, as far as the rest of the mob are concerned, it's very rarely we get the opportunity to meet two fine advocates like you both. And all we get are people who, a lot of the time, are just sort of mouthpieces for the government, or the people that the shock jocks on 2-second radio and television choose to expose to us. So if we're looking for just a bunch of questions, I'm concerned about the process so that we can get to hear voices like yours and all the other fine people. You could probably reel off names and names and names to us. I'd just like to comment on that. Thank you.
I mean, that is a very real question, isn't
Absolutely.
it? Absolutely. The actual being able to discuss it in
We're very aware of this, and we have indicated, that's why the process was important to us, to get agreement with the leaders. We knew, what work had already been done by the expert panel, by the, Pearson's proposal, by the Joint Select Committee's reports, and, other models that have been put up by supporters and, and then the naysayers, who are firming up because it's getting serious now. And they'll come out of the woodwork, don't you worry. But we know the importance of consultation, and I think that, and we've asked the government, to seriously give us these consultations, these regional consultations, and they will range in number from anything from 12 to 40. We don't know how many they'll fund yet. But
as in 12 sessions or 40
different
sessions
locations.
Or different locations? Okay.
Different locations around Australia. And I think there'll be ample opportunity, for us to have like town hall meetings and things like that, if local governments invite people to talk about it. There'll probably be a bit more wider opportunity for other people besides Noel and Warren to speak. And I'd be very happy to speak anywhere.
The meeting at Kirribilli House that we're talking about, our aim in going in there, the majority of the delegates around that table was to get a commitment from the Prime Minister and, depending how the next election goes, the opposition leader, to firm up a process. Because the Prime Minister did say he's still very keen on 2017 for a referendum.
Does that feel too soon to you, not soon enough?
Well, look, and I don't fully understand, and maybe Frank and George has a better understanding than I, but apparently to get a successful referendum up, there's a whole big process you've got to go through, whether it's going to be successful or not. So 2017 I think is quite ambitious, but I think it can be done. But doesn't leave a great deal of time for what I call community conversations about what it all means.
George, sorry.
Yeah, go on.
What were you going to say, George?
Well, certainly in terms of the timing. I mean, I think 2017 is possible, but not at the rate we're currently moving.
Exactly.
And in fact, at the current rate we're currently moving, I think this decade or even the next decade is looking a bit unlikely, to be frank.
Really?
Because what we've seen is this will be the third round of community engagement over the last 5 or 6 years. And what we have not seen yet injected into the process is any way of resolving these issues. And,
I was going to say there does sort of seem to be a feeling of deja vu about all of this in terms of the community consultations.
Yeah, can I say, well, no, I disagree. I actually think what Recognise has done, they've raised awareness, a campaign around constitutional reform, the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia's constitution. That was their role, and that's what they've done. That's not consultation. That's raising awareness. That's a campaign to get to feel whether the majority of Australia's population would support it. And some of the polls says, well, the majority of Australia's population would support it. But the community conversations that need to happen are about, well, what does that mean? Yes, we support referendum reform, but what do you mean by that? Is it symbolic? Is it substantial? What are the questions? What is the bill that's going to... So they're the conversations that need to happen in the next 6 months.
And not just in places like the Wheeler Centre,
No.
but out in Western everywhere.
And they call them constitutional conventions. And I'm learning this language, by the way. So these conventions are for the general wider public to come and listen to what's being proposed
And discuss it.
and discuss it and have a point of view. Now, we've argued with the Prime Minister at Killabilly House that that's great and it's got to happen in a 6 months period, so, you know, you need to dust off the cobwebs. But we also need more focused conversations with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia, because that we haven't done in a big way. So what the proposal is, and Pat mentioned it before, was to have, if you're going to have these conventions, whether it's 12 or 40 in 6 months, because that's the time frames leading up to 2017, a lot more needs to happen, drafting of bills and questions and everything else. The time frame is short, but it is doable if the will is there to do it.
We've got one question down the back, but I just really want to ask Frank as well, because I mean you've been such a prominent figure in this for such a long time. How do you feel about the rate at which it's currently going, and how do you feel that the impetus is moving at this stage?
Oh, I agree with what others have said. It's been too slow. And as I said at the outset, this requires better leadership by our elected leaders.
I agree.
And, you know, I give them full credit for what they did at Kirribilli House for a couple of hours, but there's got to be skin in the game.
Yes.
And there's got to be real commitment and engagement.
And we
it
told them
just
that.
hasn't been there. And, you know, it's not good enough just to take a hands-off approach and say, let's see what percolates up to the top.
Yes.
That's not the way you get constitutional change in Australia.
And look, the other quick thing I was going to say is what you need is to move from these great community conversations to the mass market.
Yes.
I mean, let's say these events are wildly successful and you get 250 people at each. Well, that's 10,000 Australians who are involved, and 14 to 15 million Australians will vote on this.
Yeah.
So what is the mechanism to take it from the community conversations to actually get a majority of 7 to 8 million people?
Absolutely.
And that's the bit that's missing.
Yes.
And without that and political leadership and commitment, we will never get past the community conversation stage where we've been since 2007.
Okay, down
Hello
the
there.
back, down there.
I'm a complete Luddite in terms of the Constitution, and I suspect a great many people are. What would be really helpful to know as part of the overall debate, I imagine, would be to understand where are the stinky parts of the Constitution, because I actually don't know them, and a lot of people don't. And I think as part of the overall future conversation, it'd be nice to know these are the parts that we object to. And I heard one example early on at the very beginning of a section, I forget.
25.
25. I think that would be wonderful to be able to highlight that these are the problem areas. What are your comments about that? Because I know there's this movement, things are wrong, but I'm not sure what they're wrong about.
I have the clauses here, if you would like me to read them out to you. Would that be an appropriate thing to do, or would you like to talk about that, George, just so that...
Look, I can probably encapsulate them even
Sure,
more
go
briefly.
for it,
Section
yeah.
25, the states can stop people voting because of their race. Section 51(26) put in there because our first Prime Minister said we needed a federal power for the coloured and inferior races in this nation. It was put there to let the federal parliament discriminate against people on the basis of their race, to deny them jobs, deny them the right to live with the white settlers. It's still in the Constitution and was extended to Aboriginal people in 1967. So we've got racism written into the DNA of this document. It's never been taken out. And I'd say, as someone who works in this area, I think it's a bit shameful that we as a community are the only nation in the world that still empowers and licenses racial discrimination from the most basic set of rules of this nation.
Okay, one question here. Oh, was that a question? Yes.
Thank you. I'm just wanting to get a sense from the panel of the your views about the notion of recognition. It is going to take a long time, and there has been a lot of, or some momentum so far. But I'm just wondering what you think might be the fears among the wider community about this notion of recognition if we have racism entrenched in the Constitution, and I suspect embedded into the national psyche as well in many ways. What are the fears, or perhaps the non-fears, in the wider community about recognition?
This may well be our last question, actually, because I've just had a look. It's 7:12, so we don't have a lot of time yet. But Jill, were you just in Cooper Pedy having a discussion about this? Did I hear you saying that earlier in the green room?
A couple of years ago.
Oh, a couple of years ago. Okay,
Yes.
all right.
I did a road trip with Recognise from South Australia right up to Alice Springs, and we stopped in all the communities speaking to Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal people about constitutional reform and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia's constitution.
And what were the fears expressed to you there?
Look, there wasn't a lot of fears. No one has sort of expressed fears as to why they would vote against something like that. There was a lot of, I don't really understand why or what the issue is. A lot of our Australian people don't really know that, one, we've got a constitution and what's in it. A lot of them don't even care, really. So I didn't come against anyone who had fears about if we were mentioned we'd own Australia, but there was concerns. There was some people who expressed some very concerns about why Aboriginal people, why not other Australians, you already get too much, and all those sort of ill-informed, preconceived ideas that people have in their minds.
So just really quickly from the rest of the panel before we wrap up, I mean, what are your greatest concerns, I suppose, just to parse that question a little bit, about what the barriers that might, that this quest might hit on the way? We'll start with you, Frank, and then...
Well, I think on the recognition question, I think most Australians would be happy to recognise what you might call the past history. Where you start to get a bit of static is the recognition of present realities, and particularly the recognition of future aspirations. Now, I'm one of those non-Aboriginal Australians who is very proud of the fact that I live in a society where I would want to espouse into the future the entitlements of those who are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders living in this post-colonial society, where they do have aspirations, particularly in relation to land, country, spirituality, culture, traditions, heritage, which I as an Australian would want our constitution to acknowledge. But I acknowledge there are some Australians who say, well, no, I'm prepared to acknowledge the past, but I then want to draw a line and make as if there's absolutely no differences between any of us for the future.
Go back
and
to
I think that's where
go back to year zero, as it were. Yeah, start again. Okay, Patricia, just...
Well, I want our 40,000 years of history acknowledged properly, and I want our cultural heritage, languages, lands, sea rights protected for our future.
And when you speak to people about this who are against that, what do they say to you?
Well, I haven't met anybody against it yet, because I don't really associate with shock jocks and people like that.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, you must... You're
no,
aware...
honestly, I haven't met anybody who is against it. I think that people do not understand the constitutional system as well as they should. I think I've got a reasonably good understanding of it as an Australian, Aboriginal, but I think people of, fair-minded goodwill. I think there will be the naysayers, who will come out of the woodwork in droves, and they will deny it on the basis of giving special treatment to Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders, whereas I don't think it's special. I think it's just correcting the record.
And George?
Yeah, certainly my greatest fear isn't at the community level. I think that, community values are consistent with recognition in racism out. And I think the polling is consistent in showing that, and also the great dynamic of education. When people hear what's in there, they don't think it should stay in there. They think that we should have a constitution that respects everyone in this community and provides for equal and fair treatment. It's common sense. My greatest fear is our leaders aren't up to delivering it. And that we live in a community where our leaders haven't shown a great capacity for nation building, positive development of this or other kinds. And my fear is perhaps that this will fall by the wayside, like many other important policies, because we don't have the political capacity to deliver on what is a very strong community desire for change.
Okay, well, we are working against a tight deadline, as everyone here has acknowledged this evening, if we're going to get this up by 2017. So hopefully we'll be able to have many more discussions like this, of this ilk, throughout the country. And but let's finish this evening by thanking and acknowledging our guests tonight, Jill Gallagher, George Williams, Patricia Turner and Frank Brennan. Thanks very much.
Thank you.